In this video, I'm going to show you how to make music like the progressive house artist Cid Inc. Cid Inc is a powerhouse producer, top of the progressive house scene, being one of my personal favorite producers, creating some very influential progressive house. The way this video will work is I will be showing each individual step, starting from the kick, the bass, the drums, and the synth. Then I'll do a quick arrangement and some fine tuning, doing my best to explain every step of the way so you can learn how to make music in this style. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you get more videos like this one. And if you want to grab the project files, make sure to click in the link in the description below. You can download the project, the presets, the samples, everything included in this track in the video. Starting off with the kick drum, this style of progressive house usually has a very quick kick drum, maybe a couple hundred milliseconds of sub, usually not a super long tail, and usually a nice crispy high end that's punching through the mix very well. So not bad. I do want to shorten it just a little bit to get more of that punchiness and allow for my other bass elements to get through. Maybe fade out a little bit more. Great. I just have an EQ cutting out the really low rumble frequencies, and the kick is in E, but the track is G minor, and it's at 122 beats per minute. So I want the kick to be in the root note of my scale, which is going to be G. So I'm going to push this up on the transposition here from E to F sharp, and then to G. So now the kick is in G. I can double check with my EQ here. And we're hitting at about 49 hertz, which is a G. I'm going to grab a drum bus and throw that on. The drum bus is great for kicks. It has compression in it, some saturation. It just really helps the kick feel full and powerful. Push the dampening up all the way. The drive I put up to maybe 10%, and the crunch I'll put up to maybe 20. And then before and after. A little bit less drive and a little less. And that sounds good. Let's move on to the bass line. Before I get into the bass line, I want to explain what rolling essentially means in this type of energy. So if you've heard the term before, you probably know what I'm talking about, but if you haven't or you're unsure what it means, essentially the term rolling just means that the energy is constantly flowing kind of forward. It doesn't feel very chuggy, doesn't feel very broken up. It's very repetitive, very vibey. The track just feels like it's kind of going through a nice consistent motion, where maybe other genres like house or tech house, they're still vibey, but they feel like they're a bit more like this, where rolling feels like a constant smooth motion going through. I will be using the term rolling a lot because it does help articulate the vibe that I'm going for with this track and this style. Going to the bass, I'm going to drop in a wavetable and we're going to make a pluck. Going to use a sawtooth for this, and my amplitude, I'll bring the sustain up. Envelope 2, I'll leave the sustain at 50%, bring the frequency down, and then change this to 24. Go into the matrix, filter 1 frequency on envelope 2, maybe around 20, and then bring the octave down to negative 24 semitones. That's down 2 octaves. And now we have a nice bass line. I've EQ'd out the top end. I don't need those high frequencies because it's a bass line, so I don't really need it, but I love that warmth that comes with the sawtooth bass. If I use just a sine, it's nice and strong, but it doesn't have those nice frequencies and harmonics up in the higher range. So let's go closer to a sawtooth, but not all the way. So we're getting a lot of frequencies, but it's not so gritty. And it sounds a little bit like a pluck, so it's nice and punchy. Looking at the actual MIDI here, if I take out the higher notes, we can just focus on the repetitiveness of the core bass line here. And this is going to give us that rolling feeling as well, because it's going to be very repetitive and it's not leaving a lot of empty space. It's kind of filling up every little bit of space with the bass, so it doesn't feel so choppy because there's not really a lot of silence in between the bass notes. And we'll listen with the kick. Catchy, it's hooky, and it feels rolling. So what I did with the higher octave is I filled up some more of the empty space, and it gives it a bit more excitement and a bit more life. To make it feel even less kind of choppy and a little bit more rolling, I'm going to add a little bit of release onto the amplitude and onto the envelope here. This just gives it a little bit more tail, and it doesn't feel like the bass line is so cut and dry, which again makes this feel a little bit more flowy and a little bit more rolling. It's a nice tip. Moving on to the bass hook. So I'm going to grab a serum for this, throw that onto the bass hook. If you don't have serum, you can use any synth that you're comfortable with. And I'm going to change this to wah wah. And this one I will put to the harmonic series. So we have the nice sine wave, but when I move the wavetable position, it's going to double the frequency. Okay, so I'll push this up a few, and I will bring the octave down -2, and the octave here will be -1. Put the unison up to 2 here, and the detune down almost all the way. Maybe I'll do 3. Okay, so that's the unison is at 3, the detune is down. I'll bring the level almost all the way up. My cutoff filter, I will bring down to maybe 20-ish hertz, 18 hertz. Put the filter on B so that we're filtering out both sides, and turn the filter on. Put this up to 18 or maybe 24, and the drive up a little bit of release on the amplitude. Going into envelope 2 now. Same thing, a little bit of release, but I'll bring the sustain down to about 50% and the decay down to about 400 to 500. So this envelope 2 is going to be placed on the cutoff. So we're making a pluck from this. Bring this down quite a bit, and we can take a look at the MIDI and take a listen to how it sounds so far. It sounds pretty high end, but you'll notice that it's catchy with the kick. And this is really important to this style. You want to use a lot of hooks, whether they're hooks with bass lines or percussive elements or melodies. The hooks are what are really going to drive this track to feeling like that rolling feeling that I was talking about. You want it to feel really groovy and catchy, and this is the way to do it. Even if the hooks are very simple, it's going to make the track feel very, very interesting, and you're going to be able to write those 7 or 8 minute long tracks without it getting boring because you have these nice hooks that are keeping the listener engaged. So you're going to notice I'm going to be using a lot of hooks in the entire video. Let's go into the serum again, and I'm going to actually use this as an FM sound. So let's bring this down here, and I'm going to change this to FM from B. And now when I turn this up, you'll hear it change a bit. There is usually a sweet spot. So if we go up too high, it gets a little fuzzy. But when we get to about here, it starts to sound nice and crispy. And if I move this wavetable position, it's going to change how it sounds as well. So I like the way that it sounds right there, and let's try that with the bass line as well. But first, I'm going to EQ out that low end, and that's very important. This is just a hook. It's there to complement the bass. It is there to make the bass line feel more interesting without kind of taking over the main idea or the main bass line. I'm going to filter out that low end quite a bit, at least up until about 100 hertz, and take out some of that strong bass frequency there as well. I just want this to be catchy and actually complement the bass line. Last, I'll put some delay on just to make it a little bit more interesting, and very low, dry, wet just to get a little bit out of it. A little bit of movement, maybe put this to a 5. And let's listen with the bass line and kick again. See how much movement there is now? So we have that bass line with the octave creating some movement and some swing, and then we have the extra bass hook here, which is creating even more of a groove, and it's really catchy and really interesting. So, and it's just the 2 layers so far. We have 2 more to use. Moving on to this second bass layer, I'm just gonna grab everything from the first one and drop that onto the tom bass. I do this a lot in my videos and in my tracks because just duplicating the same sound and then making it another layer is a great way to keep that theme of the song. You don't have to recreate every sound every time. Just duplicating this over and making slight changes is going to give me another element to the song that still feels like it fits really well. So I'll just back off the FM a little bit. Maybe turn down the cutoff a little bit. And a little bit less FM. And now we have this third element. And the only difference with the MIDI is I actually just grabbed this MIDI and dragged it and dropped it down and moved it over 2 notes here. So now, again, it's a very simple MIDI. It's just following the same pattern, but moved over slightly. And this can get messy very quickly. I do want to caution you that if you just start throwing in all these layers that are mismatched and not overlapping, or they're overlapping too much, it can get messy. It can get convoluted. So you have to be checking and making sure that the layers you're adding are adding to the groove. They're not pulling away from the groove. They're not making it less groovy. You want these to be feeling like you're adding to the groove. So we can take a listen. And to me, it sounds like it's adding extra layers of detail and it's making it feel more full and groovy. Okay, again, duplicating over the serum and the delay and the EQ onto this bass hook too. And I've just moved the MIDI over to the right by 2 notes. Like, it's just super simple. Don't need to make it super complicated as long as it's catchy. Go into the serum. Let's push this up a little bit. And let's push this up a few octaves as well. Get it nice and high sounding. Okay. Let's listen with the kick. And with the rest of the bass elements. It feels full, it feels like there's a lot going on, but it's not too much going on. It just feels like a lot of little details that are carrying that bass line forward and making it feel nice and rolling. If it makes you want to bob your head and tap your toe, that means it's groovy, and that means it's a good groove and it's working. That's what you want. You want the track to be groovy. That's why it's a dance track. I just want to push up the bass hook a few decibels, and I want to change this bass hook. I changed this to a -2 octave instead of a -1. Sounds a little bit better. Moving on to the drums. With Cid Inc.'s style of drums, there's a couple things to consider. Usually very punchy, crispy hats that punch through the mix but aren't overwhelmingly loud. The shakers are very full sounding and very swingy and groovy. And then you have the claps that are pretty tight and just complement the kick drum. But the part that really stands out to me the most with Cid Inc.'s tracks is the percussion that he has. There's usually a couple of percussion sounds that are easily identifiable in a Cid Inc. track. Cid Inc. sometimes uses percussion that they're really identifiable. They're unique sounds that are maybe even unconventional, not very common, but he uses them in a way that's catchy and groovy, and it really makes the track stand out. A lot of the time, this percussion really helps drive the track and make it more interesting as well. I'm going to show you an example of the percussion that I'm using in this loop. I made this with something that I called the Voco Looper, which is a rack that you can actually download, the same place that you can grab the project files. So if you want the project files and that rack that created this loop, then click in the link in the description below. This is how the loop sounds. I've just added some extra EQ and some has effect to make it wide. This adds to the loop because I'm adding some mid frequencies to the loop that don't really come with hi-hats or shakers. So listening with the kick, again, I want to make sure that it sounds catchy and groovy. So let's take a listen. And to me, that sounds catchy. It sounds swingy and it gives you that rolling feeling because it's constant and it's more of a vibe. So I'll turn that off for now. I'll show you what this loop sounds like with and without that at the end. But before we do that, let's move on to the hi-hats. Going in with the hi-hat, I have a punchy hat and then this open hat for some tail. So I'm going to fade in a little bit. I don't want that open hat to be so aggressive. And I don't want so much of a tail. So I'm going to fade it out a little bit. And then I'm going to turn this down quite a bit. Maybe a little bit more tail. So I have the punchiness from the first hat, and then the second hat is just adding a little bit of that fullness. But the hat does have a lot of mid and lows, so I'm going to filter out a lot of that. I want this to be a little bit brighter, so I'm going to push the transposition of the open hat up a little bit. And then I'm going to compress those together. So I'll put a 4:1 ratio, roughly, pretty much instant attack. I just want to compress a little bit and give it a little bit of volume. Sounds good. Moving on to the clap, I do have 4 layers of clap here, and this might be a little overkill, but I have the hook clap, I have clap 1, clap 2, and then the reverse clap. So for the hook clap, it's just there to add a little bit of swing to the loop. So we can listen to that with the kick. Right? I'm just using a small hook, something catchy, to just keep the loop more interesting. But for the clap 1 and 2, these are my actual claps that I'll be using on the 2nd and 4th beats. And I have one that's a little bit lower and one that's a little bit higher. Then I can just EQ them all together because we don't need all that low end. Maybe push up the mids a little bit. And this reverse clap, I put after the clap. So if we look, the reverse clap is actually after. And this is something that I noticed in a lot of Cid Inc's tracks, is that he'll put a clap and then kind of like this swingy thing at the end of the clap. So the clap like hits and then it goes, it just adds a bit more swing to it. So I didn't want to spend time fine tuning the exact position that I did here, but all I did was just grab a clap and reverse it and then choose the ins and outs here and then fade in a little bit on both sides. Fade in, fade out, and it sounds like this. Just a little bit of white noise from the tail of the clap. But if you listen with it, just the clap here, it sounds like it's going pow, and it just sounds really nice and swingy. So, and if you're gonna do this, you want it to kind of be really short, like a 16th note, and just really quickly kind of hit back. So let me go ahead and add some saturation onto that clap. Just give it a nice little bit of crunch. Only 1 or 2 dB, maybe 3 or 4 dB actually is enough. Just to give it some bite and some power. Then I can go into the shakers here. And the first thing I notice is that I have -7 milliseconds. If you don't see this, it's this D right here, this little D in the tab over here. And this is going to bring up the delay, essentially, tab, where it's going to be delaying back or forward your MIDI notes. And this is really great if you want to offset things a little bit, just by a few milliseconds. So I have my shakers, and I plan on using the has effect for these shakers. And with the has effect, I'm adding a bit of delay, about 7 milliseconds. So I'm actually pushing 7 milliseconds forward in the has effect and then pushing back 7 milliseconds here just to make sure that I'm still in the middle of that kind of MIDI area that I want to be in. This is just very, very fine tuning aspect, but it's just something I wanted to mention because it is very useful. If you want things to sound a little bit more swingy, you can push this forward or back a few milliseconds. Maybe your clap, you can push forward or back to 1 or 2 milliseconds just to get a little bit of humanization on the sounds. So going into the shakers, this nice shaker at the top, this cabasa shaker, and then this tambourine. I've changed the velocity so that it goes down when the kick hits, and it just feels a little bit more groovy this way. So it just gives you that immediate groove again, that flowing rolling motion. And then I can actually add some EQ and some sidechain compression onto this as well. So let's EQ out that low end. Don't need that. And then I can put the has effect on. You can hear without. Just gives us that nice width. And then I'm going to put my compression from the kick drum and pull that down a few decibels. And you can really, if I pull this down a lot, you'll really hear it. You get that pumping effect. And that's kind of what I did with the velocity already. So you don't need to use that on the velocity. You can just use sidechain for this. But I like to use both. You get that nice pumping and it gives you that rolling motion as well. With Cid Inc type loops, there's usually a lot of elements going on. So I just added this tambourine and it's just giving it a little bit of extra, so a little bit of one shots in this loop just to keep it a little bit interesting. So just very, very basic, just throwing them in there. So as the snare sounds okay, but this is a kind of a weird percussion element. Just EQ'd out the low end, added some stereo width with the has effect, some delay to keep it playing a little longer and delaying, and then some auto pan. I'll turn it up a little bit because they're going to be pretty quiet. Going on to the percussion one. Like I said, there's a lot of percussive elements. This one is more of an actual hook. So if I open up the MIDI, we can take a listen. So it's catchy, it's hooky, and that's a main theme of these types of tracks. You want a lot of hooks, a lot of hooks. The more hooks, usually the catchy it's going to be to an extent. Obviously, you can overdo it by adding too many elements, but with Cid Inc style tracks, there's usually quite a few little hits and hooks and percussion elements that are groovy and catchy like this. Using 16th notes, you usually can't go wrong at the placement of these. Just place them in a way, again, that feels catchy, that when you play along with the kick or the metronome, it feels catchy. It feels like you can bob your head to it. And that's really the simplest test. If you can bob your head, if it makes you feel like you want to tap your toe, feels catchy, it probably is, and it's probably in a good placement that can benefit the track. Of course, you want to be checking with the rest of your elements, because if you do add something that is kind of pulling away from the groove, you want to make sure that you take that out. Just turning it up. And that sounds pretty good. Last, I had this final percussive element here. Just another percussion that I added in. Nothing crazy, just something to give it a little bit more movement in the whole loop. And then I've added some reverb. All these percussive elements are just adding a little bit of ear candy to make it feel like it is not going to be so repetitive. Let's take a listen to the whole loop with that percussion loop in as well. So before and after with that percussion loop, and just feel how much extra texture it's bringing to the loop and just really making it feel like it's not so stale or repetitive. So even though it's quiet, it's got that nice texture that's just filling up that empty space, and it just makes it feel like it's identifiable, it's unique. Again, if you want this, the download is in the link in the description. It's called Voco Looper. You just throw that on one of your channels with a percussive sound and play with the settings, and you can get some really cool repetitive sounding loops like this. Turn up this perk 2 and down the perk 1. And turn up the tambourine perks right here. Just play with some of these volumes here. I move the hat up. Turn the percussion 1 and 2 down. And the shakers up a little bit and clap up a little bit. You usually want that hat to be the strongest element in the drum loop, because you want that relationship between the kick and the hat to feel like the kick's going down and the hat's kind of pulling up. So it's like boom, tss, boom, tss. So we want the hat to be nice and strong and prominent and cut through the mix. Moving on to the synths, we can add to the atmosphere with more hooks as well. So you can make the track feel like it has some melody, but also in a way that, again, is making it feel catchy and groovy and rolling. And all these together are going to make this feel very professional and make it feel very vibey and sound more like a Cid Inc track, because his tracks usually do consist of that rolling energy. The top pluck. So I just have this on the G5. It's just very simple. All these hooks are very simple, but they're adding to the track. So I'm going to go up to this bass here, and I'm going to actually grab the wavetable and throw that onto the top pluck and duplicate that over. So now I'm going to push up the frequency a little bit, go into the matrix and push up the LFO up to close to 10 on the wavetable position and the frequency. And then LFO 1, I'm going to turn off the retrigger. We can just take a listen to this first. The retrigger is off. Let's turn the speed down a little bit. And the amount down a little bit. Frequency up a little bit more. Then I'll just turn the unison on. Classic. Just about 10%. And a little bit of delay. Just a little bit. Okay, great. Last, I'm going to add some EQ and a vocoder on it. So EQ, Boop. So EQ just to cut out that low end. Let's go actually past the vocoder so we can make sure we're not getting any weird artifacts. Then I'm going to just draw in a little pattern here. It doesn't really need to be anything special, and change this from noise to pitch tracking. So that's a little bit more interesting. We can turn the depth up, performance, release down a little bit. You can't hear it very well, but I'm going to turn down the dry wet. And we'll push the performance up quite loud and the depth up all the way. So you can hear what it sounds like. Just a weird little saturated sound, and we'll bring the dry wet down. Just giving us that nice weird high end to make it even more unique. And then we can put an auto pan on here as well, just to make it even more interesting to the ear. It's gonna be a very subtle sound, but it's just giving a bit of melodic atmosphere and kind of carries the track. Moving on to the pad, I just used some presets for this. So if you don't have pigments, I will be exporting this into audio, freezing and flattening the track in the project file. So you can actually get access to this pad, even if you don't own the synth, but you can use any pad for this. It's just a really, really nice lush pad that I found and tweaked a little bit. Either way, you can use whatever pad you like. And I'm going to open up the MIDI here. And it's just important to realize that I'm just using 2 notes with 2 octaves. So the G, and then the 5th, which is a D. You can use more in the notes in the scale, but honestly, just a couple notes is usually all you need. You even could just use 1 note, just the root note. But giving it that 5th gives it a little bit of an uplifting energy. And I'm looking for a pad that's nice and lush with a tiny bit of movement. The movement is nice because it keeps the track interesting and the listener engaged. Just slight movement. And then I could throw a reverb on here as well. Some low cut. And I don't even need to EQ out much, just maybe reduce the lower a little bit. And that sounds really nice. The preset here, if you want to use it, I did tweak it a little bit. I don't remember exactly what I did, but it is the Lost Sun preset. And it just sounds really, really beautiful. And that's really it for the pad. Just choose a nice lush sounding pad or create one for yourself and just have a constant chord. You can just use a really simple minor chord or even just a single chord. You can play through the whole track and it'll give it that nice vibe. Or if you're feeling more musical, you can of course change the chords, but keeping it 1 chord works as well. Next, I have this really cool preset that I found that I thought was perfect for the Cid Inc track. I'm just gonna draw in the MIDI here. It's just gonna be 2 notes, the G and the G. And it's this cool preset that I found and tweaked a little bit as well. It's called Move Main, and it's using this function to draw out kind of the settings that are being tweaked in the sound. So we get this really, really cool sound. You can see that little dot that's following. It's creating that movement in the sound. I know Cid Inc uses these kind of weird, kind of pitch bending sounds in some of his tracks. So I found this nice preset that you can add to this. And let's take a listen to the whole track so far. We just have 2 more sounds, the lead and the riser, and then we can focus on the actual arrangement of the track. I'll do the riser first, and it'd be nice and simple. I'm just gonna grab a wavetable, throw that into the channel, and I go to Sawtooth Wave and Envelope 2. So Envelope 2, I'm going to bring the attack up to like maybe a few seconds. And then I'm going to have the sustain all the way up. That's important. And then the matrix, I'm going to put Envelope 2 onto the pitch and go up 24. So that's 24 semitones or 2 octaves. And now when I play that note, it's gonna rise in pitch. And when it gets to that top, as long as I'm holding the note, it'll stay there. And then when I let go, it'll drop down with the timing of the release. So we'll have a very quick release so that it doesn't really drop down in pitch. But then I'm gonna throw a ton of delay and a ton of reverb on that. And this is a very cool, super simple riser effect. And I know that Cid Inc uses it in some of his tracks. These nice kind of like alarm sounding synths. Let's take a listen with the effects on. Maybe we can make this a little faster. Awesome, we can put some unison on there. Sounds great. And then maybe some auto pan to really make it sound interesting. And I'm going to actually quickly automate the speed of that auto pan. Hey producers, sorry to interrupt the video. I just wanted to let you know that I do actually offer music production coaching and music production courses, so you can learn at your own pace. I currently have over 500 people enrolled in the music production courses. There is a totally new beginner course and an advanced course. So whatever your skill level, you can check out those in the description below, as well as one-on-one video coaching that you can grab where we can talk about track feedback, we can work on building your tracks, and we can really fine tune what it takes for you to become a next level producer. All right, let's get back to the video. When it's going up higher in pitch, it'll actually pan back and forth even faster. Cool, but we won't do it so obviously because we don't want it to be distracting, but just about 50%. That'll sound pretty interesting. So I'll move this all over here because that'll be part of the arrangement. I'll go into the lead next. The thing with Cid Inc's leads is a lot of the time, they're not super obvious leads. They're not crazy big leads that are taking away the attention of the track. They're usually there to complement the track in a really, really melodic way. Not all the time, but a lot of the leads are kind of brought in slowly, or they're kind of not fully in the forefront. They're a little bit in the background, more arps, just melodies that are going to make the track feel more full and interesting, but it's not like it's the main idea of the song. So I actually took a melody from one of Cid Inc's tracks and I kind of followed it and transpositioned it so that it would fit in this track. Let's go ahead and make this. So it's going to be a wavetable. I'm going to go sawtooth wave. Bring the filter down to it's maybe 700. I'm going to go envelope 2. I'm going to bring that sustain down, and I'm going to bring the decay down as well quite a bit. I want this to be a very quick pluck sound. So it's not going to be like an average pluck. It's going to be a very punchy, quick pluck. I'm going to put the unison up to random note, amount down. The second oscillator is going to be a triangle. Give it some high end. Maybe like 3/4 of the volume, and up an octave. Okay, and let's open this up a little bit more. We'll use the matrix on the filter. Okay, so that sounds pretty good, but I want this to be even more interesting. And if I look at the MIDI here, I actually have these lower notes that are kind of in between. But with the low notes, it just feels more catchy, more full sounding, but I don't like how open they are. I want them to be more subtle. So what I'm going to do is called pitch tracking inside of Wavetable. And this is a really cool technique. So you go into the MIDI and I can go where it says filter one frequency and the note here. And if I push this up or down, it's going to correlate where in the scale or where on the keyboard or the MIDI keyboard the note is and make adjustments to the filter based on that. So the lower notes will have less cutoff and the higher notes will have more cutoff. So the lower notes will sound a little bit quieter and a little bit more closed off and soft, and the higher notes will sound a little bit sharper. It's a really cool technique. So now that I've brought it up to 100, I can even do this with the amplitude a little bit as well. So note, amplitude. Now those lower plucks just sound a little bit quieter and more in the background. Now I can add a little bit of delay, a little bit of reverb. But I want to actually use a return track for this. So I'm going to grab the delay and the reverb, and I'm going to throw that onto this channel right here. So I have a delay and a reverb. I'm going to push the first one up to 100% and leave the reverb not at 100%. It's very important that we put at least one of them at 100%. And last, I'm going to grab a compressor and throw that on the end of the chain. So what I'm going to do is actually side chain compress from the lead sound. The reverb and the delay are actually going to be sidechain compressed from the lead. So when the lead is playing, it's going to punch through and just duck the reverb and delay out of the way a little bit so that you can really hear that lead come through the mix a little bit better. Let's send that track. A little bit more decay time. So we have that nice solid lead coming through, and it still has the delay and reverb, but it's being compressed to make room for that sound so that it doesn't get too muddy. Some EQ just to make sure we're not getting anything too low. Or that a little bit. Push that up a bit. I'm going to do a very quick arrangement, a quick fine tuning of the sounds and volume, and then we're going to listen to the whole thing. If you want access to the final project files with the samples, the presets, the bounced out versions of the audio for the synths that you don't own, then you can definitely grab those in the link in the description below. There's also access to lots of other project files of similar artists and different genres, so to go ahead and check that out. Okay, everybody, so I did a quick arrangement, some fine tuning of the sounds, nothing major, just 1 or 2% each way to try and make it a little bit more of a cohesive mix. I'm going to actually grab a glue compressor and throw that onto the drum loop. This is a good way of making the drums feel a little bit more glued together, obviously hence the name, but it makes it feel less dynamic and all over the place and makes it feel a little bit more swingy and groovy. Let's take a listen to that. You can see it's jumping quite a bit. I usually like to aim for 2 to 5 dB of constant reduction. I'm clipping a little bit here, so I'll turn the soft clipper on. That looks pretty good, and we'll turn this up and down the dry wet a little bit. Just brings the shakers up a little bit and the hats down a little bit. Just makes it feel all a little bit more close together. So what I've done with the arrangement is I've made a little buildup right here, and I have just really just made this more of a dynamic track. So the weird loopy bit is just kind of building up as the track is building, and then right before it breaks into the breakdown, I've taken that out. So it's building over a long period of time. It keeps the track interesting, and then this lead sound I bring in, and it's playing, building up through the breakdown, and right before the breakdown, I drop it completely out because I've been building up this sound for quite some time. This bass hook too, it starts a little quieter and gets louder, and then finally when it drops in again, it feels like a big energetic drop, and then the lead has been taken out and that other loopy bit has been taken out. This is just a very condensed version of what the track could be. If you wanted to download this and make your own spin on it, that's totally up to you. So let's go ahead and take a listen to my version of how to make music like Cid Inc. want to learn more about music production, check out one of these videos here. Make sure to subscribe in the corner and grab the project files in the link in the description below.